So before I start, I'm just going to say this is probably, actually, it's going to be guaranteed to be longer than 5 minutes because I have to go over thousands of lines of code, Unity as a whole, and then on top of that, the game itself. So it'll be a while. I'm sorry. But anyways, hello. I'm Alex Little, and this is my final project, which has a very insightful name. It's really going to plug the heartstrings. The project name is Final. So let's start with the game itself. As you can tell, this is Chrome. It's running on a browser with Unity WebGL, so I'm just going to quickly show this Unity WebGL to start the beginning of Chapter 2. So I've already completed Chapter 1, so let's have to continue by it. So, as you can see mapping, ooh, look at that, dialogue. So it's gonna go through. This is one of the longer sessions of dialogue. Originally I had Chapter 5, which has no dialogue, but this is the best chapter to show, I feel. So as you can see, there's a lot of different stuff on this map. Mountains and villages are the two big examples. In a river, you can't move on to any of that. Well, I guess I should start with the basics. Player turn 1. This is a tactical strategy game. I guess those kind of mean the same. So you click on the unit to move them. You can see in the top left corner, character information. This happens to be our main character, Samlin. If he dies, it's a game over. So essentially, you can move him. If it's red, you can't move. If it's blue, you can. You can't move on the rivers. You can't move on the mountains, not villages. Those little fortresses and bridges are okay, though. So let's move him over. As you can see, his weapon is the Destroyer of Worlds, which is a super cool sword. It has a 60% hit rate, and it'll do 25 damage. So there's a fight. Unfortunately, he missed. Fortunately, they both missed. So if you want to click on an enemy, you can see their stats. This is an enemy shaman. They have an 80% hit rate, and they do 12 damage, and they use dark magic. So let's use William, or Cavalier, over here. Can't really move him anywhere useful, unfortunately. Some units have a higher move, some don't. Like, magics can only move a max of 4, where this Cavalier, William, he can move up to 7 spaces. Samlin can only move 5, but as you can tell, it really wasn't that useful because he missed again. As you can see, I just killed an enemy. So I see no purpose to fully finish the chapter because who knows how long that would take. So I'll just quickly show off a couple more things. So if you decide to click again on them, they don't move. His turn is done. And also, if you decide, actually, I want to cancel this move, you can hit the escape. Unfortunately, full screen, so it goes out full screen first. Now it's out. Once you clear all the enemies, you win. If all your units die, you lose. If Samlin, your main character right here, dies, you lose. So I think it's time to go to Unity. So once it compiles, hopefully it'll go quickly. I'll just show you really quickly. So I just loaded in the middle of a scene. That was stupid of me. I should have started with the game manager, which is the aka scene 0. So if I run this, you will see, once it compiles, that I have a nice little introduction that has the story introduction, and it also has a beginning little bit of gameplay. Cool. Hit start the game. It starts the game. That's chapter 1, as you can tell. So there are scenes in Unity, which is essentially different aspects. Like each chapter is its own scene. Then we have the game manager one, which happens to just have this text. So all these are open like this is scene 0, scene 1, 2, 3, etc. And each of these scenes is also attached to a script, meaning that the scripts can change. Like you could do scene ++ to go to the next scene, for instance, or you do scene 1 to go to scene 1, which in this case would be chapter 1. That is used. I will show that. So how you get stuff to appear is you use what are called materials, which in our case, my case, since they're 2D, I only need a shader and a texture. So of course, if I go to all these, you'll see the textures. Some of them are the chapter background. Some of them are the characters. Well, all the other ones are characters except for grass, which is test. And of course, here are all the textures that I've imported. after I did the texture work. So I say, I'll go into a scene. Well, not a scene, a script. So I'm going to start with the simplest script that really doesn't have too much. This is the UI script. Really, all this does, if I go into the game and click on a unit, you see that thing on the top left I mentioned? That's what this script does. That is its purpose. It is the UI for if you click a unit. So, name, health, how far they can move, that's all shown. So let's go to global data. So this is the first. This script is essentially it's the first thing that runs, and it's what starts everything up. So the character list, which is the list of players, is established here. The enemy list, which is the list of enemies, is established here. This is also where it loads scene 1. So you imagine that load scene 1. Obviously a little bit more complex than my scene plus and all that, but this is how it actually looks here. So let's go to data types, which is where the fun stuff begins. So we start by doing variables for all the informations. Name, the character class, are they a player? Are they dead? Are they visible? What's their max health? What is their current health? What is their movement? All that is done here. We also have to declare public material of material unity. And then here we have parameters that we're going to pass in later on when we get to the individual character classes. So, of course, we're just initializing what all they equal to. So now we're a little bit further in. So now we're showing this is what all the players have. Name, texture names, character class, max health, etc. So this is now the character classes, where we give them their name. Each character is a class, which also... Here they're not given their textures yet. You will see where that is later. But here we have information for their textures, where they start, their level, class, health, movement, all of that fun stuff. And once we get down to the enemies, we do that for the enemies as well. So once we go even further, now we're onto a new class where we're actually placing these characters. This here in quotes, that is the texture name. That is where we give them their texture name. We also give them their row, column, and their level. Obviously, we have to give them new stuff for every level. And different levels have more units or less units in enemies' cases. So that's how we place them. Then we also do the same thing for enemies. Again, with the textures being there and the level at the end being the two really big things, and it calls the character class upon it. Once we go here, this is just getting the character list and making sure it can find the texture. Same thing for the enemies. The great thing about this is you can have multiple of the same character class appear on the same level with multiple of the same texture with the way this is set up. So you can have multiple enemies wielding an axe, or you can have one. It's really up to the designer in this case, which in this case is me. Now we go down, we have a stuff for weapons. We do the same thing except for weapons, because when we have battles, if you know, well, technically if we go back a little bit, you'll see that when we did the character classes, we also gave them we did all the stuff for, like, if I go up really quickly, weapons equal new enemy lance. Well, we create the weapon in a weapon class down here, which we essentially give it its damage, its hit rate, and what it'll be called on the UI. If we go down even further, now we're getting to places where you can't move. Now, originally we tried to do one list. I say we because from points I had help with my dad. It didn't work, so on the final day, I myself essentially made it so that every chapter has their own list and function. I'm pretty proud that I came up with that solution myself. And I'm not going to scroll down more because there's 500 lines of code of locations you can't move to. So now we're going to move to the really fun stuff with chapter controls, which is where the game itself actually happens. So obviously we're starting in just the top. It goes back to the lists that were created in global data. Chapter, again, going back to global data. Global data is kind of coming up a little bit more. Current enemy, current character, that's just so the computer knows what enemy is selected, which character is selected, what player, I guess you could say. When you click on things, and for movement purposes, you have the train system grid, which is the actual grid that everything happens on. You have the list for the path, for the saved colors, for saved textures. I'll go into that later. You have the list of dead people. You have the queue, which I will also go into more in depth later. Clicked index, we set it to -1, just so that we know that that the character has not moved, nothing's moved, nothing happened. If it's greater than 1, something's happened. So we set to -1 just so we know, okay, it's still... turn starts to 0. You will see why. Of course, we call the UI. We have a game running variable. I will go into that again more. Text to display, which essentially is for when you win or lose. Canvas, which is the game over screen. So we have Newman, which I understand to a degree. I had a little bit of help here, but I will say I do understand it more than question mark, which we originally had. We don't anymore. This just allows for a transition between player turn, enemy turn. And of course, we have a none there as it helps make a pause. We have our awake function, which Unity. So start, we're essentially just initializing everything, setting stuff to null, like current enemy, current character, because none are obviously selected yet. And here we're also calling what function, like if it's chapter 1, you're going to use the illegal locations list for chapter 1. And we do that for all of them, and we set game running equals true, and we call player turn, which we will get to soon. Really quickly, have a display message queue. This is just so that you don't get like all the messages at once. It makes it so that they're a little delayed. So like the dialogue, you don't get like 5 lines of dialogue all in the same second, because that would be impossible. So we just have a queue here. Load materials. This is just loading materials. Again, Unity thing. Player turn. So the turn starts at 0. The main reason that this is super important is if turn equals 0, depending on the chapter, you will get certain dialogue. As you can see, if chapter equals 1, you get that dialogue. Chapter equals 2, all the way. And then after that if statement, we have turn plus plus, which is essentially now the turns are counting, and now it is player turn 1. Of course, this for each is essentially checking, has everybody moved? Because if they've moved, it's the end, the turn's over, and then we're just displaying here this is the player turn, here's the turn that it is. Enemy turn is essentially the same thing without dialogue. Fight. So this is where the random number generator for if an attack or a counterattack hit. If it misses, it returns 0. If it hits, it returns the weapon.damage. Character.weapon.damage, because that goes back to the character, what weapon they're holding, how much damage their weapon does. Fight maybe is where all the interesting stuff happens, like if you're next to somebody, it'll call it. It'll call essentially the person who's moving will be the attacker. And it does all the information. It calls the fight maybe for the percentages. And if we go down here, it has scenarios where, like, if the defender's health is 0, it'll show defender killed. If the attacker's health is 0, attacker killed. And if neither of them die, it'll just, like, show attacker health and how much damage they did. Defender health, how much damage they did. Kill. Without opening, I'm assuming you can assume what this means. They're gone. They're dead. Is valid is a little bit more complex. This is just making sure that where you move is a valid location. Making sure there's, for instance, no mountains, no rivers, no villages, no other player, no enemy, and making sure that you're within the maximum movement. Like if you can only move 6 tiles, it'll make sure that you aren't going above 6. So enemy is valid is essentially the same thing except for enemies, except for instead of players. Character on cell, that's just making sure that in the code, the coded location of the player is where it says they are on the cell index, which is essentially, let me just go here. Let me cancel that. That's 0, 1, 2, 10, 20, 30. That's the cell index, essentially. It's just like each tile is given a value. So place characters. That is making sure that that's just placing the texture, the materials technically. Restore path. This will kind of go a little bit more to this, but this is making sure that after you move, all the proper textures are where they need to be. Making sure that you don't just have a blue tile that's a remnant of your moving, or a red tile, for instance. It also clears all the lists that we'll get into later. There is a catch here, and it does have a breakpoint because if something goes wrong here, well, it's a big deal. I had a lot of issues with this earlier on, so we just never got rid of the breakpoint because it's a big thing. On-cell enter is essentially when the mouse enters in a certain grid. This is already assumed. This is called after you already click on something. So this essentially draws the pathfinding line, whether it's blue or red, depending on is valid or isn't valid, which is where those lists that got cleared come into play, because if you move over something, it turns blue, it saves the texture that it's covering and replacing with blue. So that when you are done with move, all the textures are put back. That is essentially what this function does. On cell click is making it so that, first of all, it's checking if you're clicking on an enemy or a player. If it's clicking on an enemy, it'll just bring up the UI. If you're clicking on a player, it'll bring up the move and the UI. If you click a second time after clicking on a player, it'll move them. If you don't want to move them, you can just click in the same place twice, and that'll keep them where they are. If you want to escape this, you just hit the escape button. This sets everything move. This sets the move equal to 0, so they can't move again. As I mentioned, you can press escape to stop moving. That's what the cancel move does. It restores the path and all that. It clears the list afterwards. Player check move. This is just checking. Has every player moved? Same thing for an enemy. Has every enemy moved? Get enemy move is essentially the same thing that we essentially just saw. It's just checking how far they can move. Is this a valid place to move? So it's essentially just the previous functions. Move enemy, again, is essentially just placing the enemy as well. So all stuff that was done for the player just has to have its own function because you're not using a mouse to do it. Place 1 is, I'll actually go to place players first. Place players is essentially, in the beginning, it's just putting the players where they're supposed to start. And place 1 is the texture aspect of that. They're two different functions. So now we're down to the last few stuff, actually. So game over. If you lose, it tells you that you died. It brings up that big window, and it says the game running equals to false. Essentially what the game running does is it means if game running equals false, you can't move anything, there's no turn. This essentially prevents it, as I mentioned. If your main character dies, it's a game over. This prevents it for if he dies from you still playing in the background, using your remaining units to finish off the enemy and technically completing the chapter. It just prevents that from even being possible to begin with. The win is very similar. The only difference is here, depending on the chapter, you'll get certain dialogue. That's about it. It still sets it to game running equal false, still brings up the giant menu, unless it's chapter 5 where it just leaves you in the dialogue with a to be continued. Remove dead. Originally we were going to make it so that, I say we because again, this is something I had help on. I wanted to make it so that if a character died in an earlier chapter, they wouldn't return. Thankfully it didn't work, because if it did work, this would essentially be impossible to complete. Because it is the game, not the code. The game would be impossible if this actually worked, so... unintended feature. So exit chapter is essentially just, if you lost and hit the button, it brings you back to chapter 1. If you won and hit the continue button, it brings you to the next chapter. That simple, it just changes the scene. As you can see, like, if you lose, it sets the chapter to 1. And actually, chapter ++, as I mentioned earlier, if you win, that's what the button does. That's the code for it. So update, every frame, this is called. So essentially, just make sure that the game is running before anything happens, because if it isn't running, you don't need to be here. So of course, this just checks to make sure you're not pressing any buttons if you're clicking. It's checking if things have moved. It's also checking, are you dead? Or did you win? Yeah, that's the code. Just one final little thing. I had a lot of help on the first chapter, less help on the second chapter. Chapters 3, 4, and 5, I did all by myself, with no help. I accidentally broke the code, as I learned that brackets are... I already knew that braces were important, but if your braces are off, let's just say the enemy turn never ended. And they kept moving and moving and moving. I fixed it myself. I also mentioned that legal locations for the other chapters. I got that working myself. I'm pretty proud, especially of the later 3 chapters, since I did it with no help at all in one day. This was a whole ton of fun, as you can tell. 1,000 line of code here. 1,000 line of code here about. Not as much in these two, but still a lot of lines of code. Obviously, a lot of work went into the texture making, getting the textures in the map. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the final product. In the link that I turned this in, I'll also leave the link to play the game if you so choose to play the game. Thank you very much. It was a fun class.